The first time Clara Belle Monroe stepped into the dusty street of Dry Creek, the town's morning shadows seemed to reach for her like accusing hands. Her boots whispered against the warped boards of the walkway, each step measured and unhurried, though the weight of all those eyes burned like desert sun on the back of her neck. She wore a plain gray dress cinched with a length of coarse rope, a makeshift belt that hinted at both poverty and defiance. Over her face hung a thin veil, torn at one edge, but still determined to shield her from their stares, and a wide-brimmed hat tilted low, as if to say, "Do not look too closely. I am not for your pity." But the people of Dry Creek were never known to mind their own business. They lined the edges of their porches, some leaning against the wooden posts, others perched on rocking chairs, their conversations dropping into silence as she passed. She heard the hiss of whispers, the way one hears a snake in dry grass, soft but dangerous. "Who is she? Monroe girl, isn't she? Ran off with some drifter, so I heard. Came back alone. Figures." The words pricked her skin like needles, yet she walked on. She had learned not to flinch, not to let the sound of her own name, spoken with disdain, unravel her. The rope around her waist was more than a belt, it was the reminder of a past she had cut loose, and the promise that she would not beg for anyone's mercy. The general store was at the far end of the street, a squat building with a bell above its door that rang sharply when she pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of flour, soap, and dust. Shelves bowed under the weight of canned goods and bolts of cloth. Behind the counter, Martha Calloway straightened her apron and narrowed her eyes, a look that could curdle milk. "Well, Martha," said her voice slow and deliberate, "look who's decided to show her face again. I almost forgot you were still alive." Clara kept her chin high, though she felt the tremor in her hands. "I need flour," she said simply, placing her coins on the counter. The sound of the metal was sharp, final. She had counted every cent twice before coming into town. There would be no bargaining, no charity. Martha turned with an exaggerated sigh, scooping flour into a brown sack as though each grain of it were being wasted. "You planning on baking for someone, or just keeping yourself busy so you don't have to look people in the eye?" She slid the sack forward, leaning her weight on her elbows, waiting for a reaction. Clara took the flour without a word. It was the only defense she had. Silent words would only feed them. In the corner of the store stood a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair curling slightly where it brushed his collar. Jonas Reddick. She'd heard of him. The Reddick Ranch was a day's ride from town, known for its fine cattle and the two brothers who worked it. Jonas didn't say much, folks said. Preferred horses to people. Yet, as Clara turned to leave, she felt his gaze, steady and searching, as though he were looking past the veil, past the rope and the whispers, to the woman beneath. When she reached the door, Jonas moved quietly ahead of her, holding it open. She didn't thank him. Not because she was ungrateful, but because she didn't know how to accept even the smallest kindness without suspicion. Still, something in the weight of his presence followed her out into the street, lingering like the scent of rain before a storm. By the time Clara left town, the sun was lowering toward the western ridge, spilling gold over the rooftops. She walked with her sack of flour pressed against her hip, each step measured. The silence of the open land met her like an old friend, washing away the stares, the whispers, the coldness of Martha's voice. She didn't look back. Her cabin sat on the far edge of the valley, near a creek that ran shallow in summer but sang louder after the spring thaw. It wasn't much, a single room with a table, a narrow bed, and a small iron stove. The windows were smudged, the walls bare, but it was hers. No one could take it from her. She dropped the sack of flour on the table and sat on the edge of the bed, untying the rope belt. When it fell to the floor, it left faint lines across her waist. She ran her fingers over them, not with self-pity, but as one might trace old scars, acknowledging their story without letting them define her. Outside, the last light of the day caught on the edges of her small garden. It was a patch of stubborn green in the dust, rows of beans and squash she'd coaxed from the earth with aching hands. Clara stepped outside, kneeling to pluck a weed. The earth under her nails was grounding, forgiving in a way people were not. She didn't hear the horse until it was close. The sound of hooves on dry ground carried, and when she looked up, Jonas Reddick was there, riding slow, his shadow stretching long beside him. He wasn't coming to her cabin. He was following the trail back to the Reddick ranch. Still, he looked over as he passed, his dark eyes meeting hers across the fading light. It was not curiosity that lingered in that gaze. It was recognition, as if he knew something of her solitude, as if he too carried the weight of unspoken things. Clara stood, her heart beating a fraction faster, but she said nothing. Jonas tipped his hat and rode on. She watched him disappear into the horizon until the shadows swallowed him. That night, the cabin was quiet, but for the soft hiss of the stove. Clara sat at the table, turning one of the coins she had left between her fingers. The whispers from town still echoed in her mind, Martha's voice, sharp as broken glass. She wanted to believe, she didn't care, that the opinions of strangers were just dust she could brush from her dress. But truth lingered in the dark like smoke. Loneliness was a weight heavier than gossip. She blew out the lamp and lay down. The ceiling above her, a patchwork of moonlight and shadow. Outside, a coyote howled, a single note that felt both wild and mournful. Clara closed her eyes, but sleep came slow. Somewhere, beyond the thin veil of her dreams, she kept seeing those dark eyes, watching her not with pity, but with the strange steadiness of someone who had weathered storms of his own. Morning came pale and cold. Clara rose with the sun, tying the rope back around her waist. It was not a choice but a ritual, like putting on armor before walking into battle. She carried a bucket to the creek, the hem of her dress catching dew from the tall grass. The water was clear, reflecting the pale sky, and she bent to fill the bucket, her reflection rippling in the current. For a moment, she did not see the veil or the hat, just her own tired eyes staring back. When she returned to the cabin, she heard voices on the ridge above the creek. 2 cowhands from town, their laughter sharp. They were talking about her. She knew the tone. She had heard it 100 times. "Reckon she's hiding her face for a reason," one said, laughing. "Maybe she thinks she's too good for folks." The other replied, "Or maybe not good enough." Clara's shoulders tightened, but she didn't look up. She kept walking, the bucket heavy in her hand. She had learned long ago that answering back only fed the fire. But when a rock clattered down near her feet, thrown, not hard, but hard enough to sting her pride, she stopped. She turned just enough for them to see her veil flutter in the wind. Her silence was sharp, a blade of dignity they could not touch. The cowhands snorted and rode off, their laughter fading. Clara breathed out slowly, setting the bucket down. Yet in the quiet that followed, she felt something shift. The loneliness wasn't just a weight, now was a challenge. She was tired of shrinking under the gaze of others. Late that afternoon, as the sun sank behind the hills, Clara heard the rhythmic drumming of hooves again. Jonas Reddick appeared on the horizon, his silhouette cut sharp against the gold sky. He wasn't riding past this time. He slowed, reining in his horse near her fence. "You're far from town," Jonas said, his voice low, unhurried. It wasn't a question but an observation. Like he was marking her solitude as something real. Clara stood by the garden, her hands dirt-stained and raw. "I like it that way." Jonas studied her a moment, his gaze steady but not intrusive. "Folks in town, they talk." He didn't add more, but she heard what he didn't say. "Don't let them break you." Clara tightened the rope around her waist. "They've been talking long before I came back. Won't stop now." Jonas's eyes softened, though his face remained unreadable. He tipped his hat again, almost a bow, and turned his horse. But just before he rode off, he looked back. Once, as if he were seeing through every layer she'd built around herself. When he was gone, the air felt heavier somehow, the silence louder. Clara walked back into her cabin and stood by the window, watching the horizon. For the first time since returning to Dry Creek, she felt the faintest tremor of something she hadn't dared to name hope, or maybe just the strange ache of being seen. That night, as the moon rose high and cold, Clara untied the rope belt and let it fall to the floor. She touched the bruises that were fading now, reminders of a life she'd left behind. In the stillness, a thought came to her like a whisper carried on the wind. Perhaps her story was not over yet. Perhaps there was someone out there, one man, at least, who could see beyond the veil, beyond the rope, beyond all the walls she had built. The night held its breath, as if waiting for what would come next. The days that followed carried an unspoken tension, as if the air itself had begun to hum with the quiet knowledge that something was shifting. Clara Belle Monroe kept to her cabin, tending her garden, baking her bread, walking to the creek as if the rhythm of these small acts might hold her world together. But every so often, she would catch herself pausing, listening for hooves, for the sound of a horse slowing on the ridge. Jonas Reddick did not appear again for 3 days. When he finally did, it was without fanfare or warning. Clara heard him. Before she saw him, the low, steady cadence of a single rider approaching in the late afternoon sun. He stopped at the edge of her fence, dismounted, and stood with the ease of a man who carried no hurry in his bones. "Your garden's coming along," he said, his voice even, eyes sweeping over the rows of beans and squash. His gaze was not prying but respectful, like someone approaching a sacred space. Clara, wiping her hands on her apron, said nothing at first. She wasn't sure why he had come, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know. But there was no malice in him, only a kind of quiet watchfulness that unsettled her because it saw too much. "Did you come here for something?" she asked at last, her tone sharper than she intended. Jonas tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "Just riding by," he said. But his eyes lingered on her hat, her veil, the rope tied at her waist. "Maybe I wanted to see if you're holding up." Clara almost laughed. Holding up? What did that mean? She thought of the whispers, the stares, the weight of gossip like dust settling into every corner of her life. "I don't need looking after," she said, though her voice betrayed the faintest tremor. Jonas didn't argue. He didn't step closer, but his presence filled the space between them all the same. "Not everyone needs looking after," he said slowly. "Some just need someone to see him, that's all." The words hit her harder than she expected. Clara found herself looking away, focusing on the garden rather than his eyes. No one had said anything like that to her, not since before the rope, the veil, the silence. Before she could answer, a sound split the air, a distant shout, carried by the wind. Clara's shoulders tensed. Jonas turned sharply, his hand instinctively brushing the handle of the revolver at his hip. From the hill above the creek came the sound of horses, 2, maybe 3, the same cowhands from earlier, their laughter sharp, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "Looks like you've got visitors," Jonas said, his tone quiet but laced with steel. The cowhands rode down, their grins wide, their eyes gleaming with the cruelty of men who mistook mockery for strength. "Afternoon, Miss Monroe," one of them called, tipping his hat in a way that wasn't polite at all. "Heard you've been keeping company with the Reddicks. Didn't think they liked mysteries." Clara stood her ground, though her hands clenched at her sides. "You need to leave," she said, her voice low. "Or what?" the other cowhand taunted. He nudged his horse closer to the fence, eyes scanning her with unashamed curiosity. "What you hiding under that veil? Folks say you ain't so pretty anymore." "Bet you're just..." Jonas moved then, so fast it startled them both. He stepped in front of Clara, his voice calm but iron hard. "I said, leave." There was a long pause. The cowhands shifted in their saddles, glancing at each other. Something in Jonas's stance shoulders squared. eyes unwavering, made them hesitate. He didn't need to draw his revolver. The weight of his presence alone was warning enough. Didn't mean nothing by it. One muttered, but the laughter had drained from his voice. They turned their horses and rode off, dust trailing behind them. Clara stood frozen for a moment, the echo of their words still clinging to the air. When she finally looked at Jonas, her breath caught. He wasn't looking at her with pity, quiet certainty, as though he'd known all along this would come to pass. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Maybe not," Jonas replied, "but I wanted to." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with something unspoken, something fragile, but growing. Jonas glanced at the hat in her hands, the one she always wore low. He stepped closer, his hand outstretched, waiting. Clara hesitated, but let him take it. "A hat's for shade," he said, his tone gentler now, not for hiding. Before she could stop herself, Clara reached up and lifted the veil. The air felt sharp and cool against her skin, as though she were stepping out of a shadow she'd been living in too long. Jonas's eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to hold still. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't see the scars she feared he might. He just saw her. In that moment, something inside her shifted. She hadn't realized how heavy the veil had become until she removed it. Jonas set the hat back on her head with quiet reverence, like he was returning something that had always been hers. But peace never lasted long in Dry Creek. 2 days later, Clara went into town for supplies. She walked with her head uncovered, the sun warming her face, but every step felt like a test. The whispers started before she even reached the general store. Martha Calloway's voice cut through the air like a saw. "Well, look who's decided to show off." Guess she found herself a man to play hero. Clara felt the old shame creeping in, but before she could retreat, Jonas was there. He'd come into town for his own errands, but now he was standing beside her, his shoulder brushing hers like a promise. "Afternoon, Miss Monroe," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, his tone warm but steady. "I was hoping I'd see you here." The murmurs rippled through the crowd. People stared. Clara felt her cheeks burn, but Jonas didn't move. He looked at Martha, who suddenly seemed to find the floorboards very interesting. "If you've got something to say, Martha," Jonas said, his voice even but sharp as a blade, "you say it to me." Martha swallowed hard and said nothing. Clara's heart pounded, but she stood a little straighter. For once, the weight of judgment didn't crush her. It was Jonas's hand on her shoulder, light but certain, that anchored her in place. Then Sheriff Amos Tate stepped out of his office across the street. He was a broad man with gray streaks in his beard and a gaze that missed nothing. "Enough," he called, his voice carrying over the crowd. The murmurs ceased. Amos walked over, his boots heavy on the boards. He looked at Clara, then at the faces around them. "Some of you seem to forget," he said, his voice slow but firm. "This woman saved the Parker family's lives last winter, pulled them out of that burning barn when the rest of you were too scared to move, and you repay her with gossip." The silence that followed was thick and awkward. Martha's face went pale. No one spoke. Jonas's hand pressed slightly against Clara's shoulder, steadying her as her chest tightened. She hadn't wanted anyone to know about that night. It had been her burden to carry, her own proof of worth. But hearing Amos speak, it allowed, seeing the shame on the faces of those who had judged her, was like a door opening. Jonas turned to the crowd. "If you can't see her worth," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "that's on you. I see it clear as day." Clara felt the words settle over her like sunlight breaking through clouds. She didn't bow her head this time. She looked at them, at Martha, at the others, and, though she said nothing, her silence was no longer a shield. It was strength. The rest of that day passed in a haze. When Jonas rode out toward the valley, Clara walked beside him until the town was far behind. They didn't speak much, but their silence was different. No longer heavy, but full of something unspoken, something that didn't need naming. As the evening fell, Jonas paused at the fork where his path split from hers. "You don't have to wear that veil again," he said, his tone quiet but certain. Clara looked up at him, the sky burning orange behind his silhouette. "I know," she whispered. Jonas nodded once, a small smile at the corner of his mouth, then turned his horse toward the ranch. She watched him go, the sound of hooves fading into the dusk, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something blooming inside her chest, something like hope, something like freedom. That night, Clara sat on her porch, beneath the wide starlit sky. The rope belt lay on the floor inside, abandoned. She breathed deep, the air tasting of pine and distant rain, and thought of all the ways a soul could be seen not by the world, but by one person who refused to look away. And as the night deepened, she knew her story was not ending here. It was only just beginning.